A kind-hearted man named Jason stops to help a desperate woman named Laura to change her flat tire on the side of the road. A simple act of kindness that he never thought would lead to anything more. But the next morning, a mysterious black SUV shows up at Jason's house, sparking a chain of events that will change his life forever. What was it about this seemingly random encounter that turned Jason's world upside down? And how did his selfless act ripple through his life in ways he never imagined? Let's find out. But before we dive into the story, comment below where you're watching from today. And if you enjoy this tale of unexpected twists and life-changing moments, don't forget to subscribe. Jason Brooks was the kind of man everyone in the small town of Elmwood knew and respected. At 35, he had settled into a life that, while simple, was filled with contentment. He worked as a maintenance technician at the local community center, a job that fit him perfectly. It wasn't glamorous, but it allowed him to do what he loved, help others. Whether it was fixing a broken door, repairing a leaky faucet, or simply lending a hand to someone in need, Jason was always there with a smile and a warm demeanor that put everyone at ease. Elmwood was a town where life moved slowly, where people waved at each other as they passed by on the street, and where everyone knew everyone else's business. It was the kind of place where people took care of each other, and Jason was a big part of that community spirit. He lived in a modest house on the edge of town, a small single-story home that he had inherited from his parents. The house wasn't much, but it was filled with memories of his childhood spent playing in the large oak-shaded yard and learning the value of hard work and kindness from his parents. Every morning, Jason would wake up before dawn, make himself a cup of coffee, and sit on his porch, watching the sun rise over the trees. It was his favorite time of day, a moment of peace before the world woke up and the demands of the day began. After his quiet morning ritual, he would head into town, stopping by the local diner for breakfast. The waitress there, Mrs. Carter, always had his order ready. A plate of scrambled eggs, toast, and a side of bacon. They would chat about the latest town gossip, the weather, or whatever else was on their minds before Jason made his way to the community center. His days were filled with tasks that might seem mundane to others but were fulfilling to him. Fixing things, helping out with events at the center, and just being a friendly face that people could rely on. His coworkers admired his work ethic, but more than that, they admired his heart. Jason was the kind of man who would go out of his way to help someone. Not because he wanted anything in return, but simply because it was the right thing to do. One evening after a long day of work, Jason was driving home on the quiet winding road that led out of town. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden glow over the landscape. Jason enjoyed these drives, the solitude and the chance to unwind before getting home. As he rounded a bend, he noticed a car pulled over on the side of the road, its hazard lights flashing in the dimming light. Slowing down, he saw a woman standing next to the car, clearly distressed. Without a second thought, Jason pulled over. As he got out of his truck, the woman looked up, her face a mix of relief and anxiety. She was young, in her late 20s, with blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail. Her clothes were businesslike, a pencil skirt and blouse, but they were slightly disheveled, as if she had been struggling with something. "Hey there," Jason called out as he approached. "Need some help?" The woman nodded, visibly relieved. "Yes, please. I've got a flat tire, and I have no idea how to change it. I've been trying to figure it out, but..." She gestured helplessly to the car, where the tools lay scattered on the ground. Jason smiled kindly. "No worries. I've changed more tires than I can count. I'll have you back on the road in no time." He walked over to the car, a sleek silver sedan, and quickly assessed the situation. The tire was indeed flat, completely deflated, and it looked like she had been driving on it for a bit before realizing something was wrong. Jason rolled up his sleeves and got to work, setting the jack in place and lifting the car with ease. As he worked, the woman stood by, watching him with a mixture of gratitude and nervousness. "Thank you so much for stopping," she said after a few moments of silence. "I didn't know what I was going to do." "No problem at all," Jason replied, glancing up at her with a reassuring smile. "Glad I could help." The woman shifted on her feet, her eyes darting around nervously. "I'm Laura, by the way," she said, trying to make conversation. Laura Hayes. Nice to meet you, Laura, Jason said, focusing on loosening the lug nuts. I'm Jason. Laura nodded, her expression still tense. I was on my way home from work. It's been a long day, and I guess I didn't notice the tire going flat until it was too late. It happens, Jason said. Roads out here can be rough on tires, especially if you're not used to them. Laura gave a small, strained laugh. Yeah, I'm not from around here. Just moved to the area a few months ago. Still getting used to it, I guess. Jason finished removing the flat tire and started putting on the spare. Elmwood's a nice place once you get to know it. Folks around here are friendly, always willing to lend a hand. Laura nodded again, but she didn't say anything further. Jason noticed the way she kept glancing around, as if she was expecting something or someone, but he didn't pry. People had their reasons for being nervous, and it wasn't his place to ask. Within a few minutes, Jason had the spare tire securely in place. He lowered the car back down and tightened the lug nuts, making sure everything was safe and secure. He stood up, wiping his hands on a rag he kept in his truck. There you go, he said, stepping back to admire his work. You should be good to go now. Just make sure you get that tire fixed or replaced soon. The spare is only meant for short distances. Laura let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Thank you, Jason, really? I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't stopped. Jason smiled, shaking his head. It's no trouble at all. Just glad I was passing by when I did. Laura reached into her purse and pulled out a small wad of cash. Please take this. It's the least I can do for all your help. Jason looked at the money, then back at Laura, and gently shook his head. I can't take that. Helping out someone in need is payment enough. Laura hesitated, clearly not expecting him to refuse. Are you sure? It's not much, but I really want to show my appreciation. Jason smiled again, his eyes warm and kind. I'm sure. Just drive safe and take care of that tire. That's all the thanks I need. Laura looked at him for a long moment, as if trying to figure out what kind of man would turn down easy money. Finally, she nodded, slipping the cash back into her purse. Thank you, Jason. I won't forget this. You're welcome, Jason replied, giving her a nod. Take care now. With that, Jason walked back to his truck, watching as Laura got into her car and started the engine. She gave him one last look, a mix of gratitude and something else he couldn't quite place, before driving off into the evening. As Jason climbed into his truck, he thought about the encounter. It wasn't unusual for him to help someone out. He did it all the time. But there was something about Laura that seemed different. He couldn't put his finger on it, but the nervous way she had acted, the way she had looked around as if expecting trouble, stuck with him. He shrugged it off as he started his truck and headed home. People had their own lives and their own worries, and it wasn't his place to pry. He had done what he always did, helped someone in need, and that was enough. As he drove the rest of the way home, the sky darkened, the last of the sunlight fading into the horizon. Jason was tired, ready for a quiet evening at home, but there was a lingering thought in the back of his mind. A sense that this simple act of kindness might lead to something more, something unexpected. But for now, he pushed those thoughts aside. Tomorrow was another day, and whatever came with it, Jason knew he would face it with the same kindness and strength that had always guided him. As he pulled into his driveway and turned off the engine, Jason took a deep breath, savoring the peace of the evening. He had done a good deed, just like any other day. Little did he know, this particular good deed was about to change his life in ways he could never have imagined. The next morning, Jason woke up to the sound of birds chirping outside his window, the morning sun casting a warm glow across his small bedroom. It was a routine start to what he thought would be another typical day. He stretched, rubbed his eyes, and swung his legs out of bed. The floor was cool beneath his feet as he made his way to the kitchen to start his day with a cup of coffee, just like he did every morning. As the coffee brewed, Jason glanced out of the window above the sink, taking in the view of his quiet street. The neighborhood was still, with only a few early risers out for their morning walks. His eyes drifted to the curb outside his house, where a black SUV was parked. It was sleek and new, the kind of vehicle that stood out in a place like Elmwood, where most people drove older, more practical cars. Jason frowned slightly but didn't think much of it at first. Maybe it belonged to someone visiting a neighbor, or perhaps it was just a random car that happened to be parked there. He finished making his coffee and sat down at the kitchen table, flipping through the morning paper. But as he sipped his coffee, he couldn't help but glance back out the window at the SUV. It was still there, parked in the same spot with no sign of anyone around it. The minutes ticked by, and the SUV didn't move. Jason found himself growing more curious. It wasn't like him to get caught up in other people's business, but something about the presence of the vehicle made him uneasy. He pushed the feeling aside, telling himself it was nothing, and went about his morning routine. After breakfast, Jason got ready for work. He grabbed his keys, locked up the house, and headed out the door. As he stepped onto his porch, he glanced over at the SUV again. The windows were tinted, making it impossible to see inside, and the engine was off. It didn't seem like anyone was in it, but the sight of it still nagged at him. Shaking his head, Jason walked to his truck, trying to put the SUV out of his mind. He had a full day of work ahead, and the last thing he needed was to get distracted by something that probably had nothing to do with him. He climbed into his truck, started the engine, and pulled out of the driveway, casting one last glance at the SUV as he drove away. It remained parked where it was, as still and silent as it had been all morning. Jason arrived at the community center a few minutes later, greeted by the familiar sights and sounds of the place. The staff was already bustling around, preparing for the day's activities. As he walked through the doors, he was met with smiles and nods from his coworkers, all of whom appreciated the steady presence Jason provided. "Morning, Jason," called out Denise, the receptionist, as he walked by her desk. "Morning, Denise," Jason replied with a smile. "Everything running smoothly today?" "As smooth as it can be," Denise said with a chuckle. "You know how it is." Jason nodded, making his way to the maintenance room where he kept his tools and supplies. He had a few tasks lined up for the day: fixing a leaky faucet in one of the bathrooms, repairing a door that had come off its hinges, and helping set up for an event in the main hall. It was nothing he hadn't done before, and he welcomed the work. As the morning wore on, Jason found himself distracted, his thoughts drifting back to the black SUV. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was unusual for a car to be parked outside his house for so long without any sign of movement. The more he thought about it, the more uneasy he became. By lunchtime, Jason decided to take a break and clear his head. He left the community center and walked down the street to the local grocery store, intending to grab a sandwich and some fresh air. The store was a short walk away, and Jason enjoyed the stroll, taking in the sights and sounds of the town he loved. As he approached the store, he noticed something that made his heart skip a beat. The black SUV was parked across the street. It was the same one, unmistakably so, with its tinted windows and sleek black exterior. Jason stopped in his tracks, staring at the vehicle. It was no longer just a coincidence. The SUV was following him. He stood there for a moment, trying to decide what to do. His first instinct was to confront whoever was in the vehicle, but he wasn't sure if that was the right move. What if he was overreacting? What if it was just a strange series of coincidences? But deep down, Jason knew that wasn't the case. Taking a deep breath, Jason walked into the grocery store, his mind racing. He grabbed a sandwich from the deli and paid for it at the counter, all the while thinking about the SUV. As he exited the store, he glanced across the street again. The SUV was still there, its presence now a looming, unsettling shadow over what should have been a normal day. Jason didn't head straight back to work. Instead, he walked in the opposite direction, hoping to see if the SUV would follow him. He took a roundabout route through town, passing by the park, the library, and a few other local spots. Each time he turned a corner, he checked to see if the SUV was still there. Sure enough, every time he looked, the SUV was close by, never too far away but always keeping its distance. It was clear now. Someone was following him, and they didn't want to be seen. By the time Jason returned to the community center, his unease had turned into a gnawing sense of anxiety. He tried to focus on his work, but the thought of the SUV lurking nearby made it impossible. He found himself glancing out the windows, half expecting to see the vehicle parked somewhere close. The rest of the day passed in a blur, and when it was finally time to go home, Jason felt a heavy weight in his chest. He left the community center, his eyes scanning the streets for any sign of the SUV. It wasn't there, but that didn't mean much. It could still be nearby, watching him, waiting for him to let his guard down. As he drove home, Jason kept checking his rearview mirror, expecting to see the black SUV tailing him. But the drive was uneventful, and by the time he pulled into his driveway, the vehicle was nowhere to be seen. For a moment, Jason allowed himself to relax, thinking that maybe, just maybe, it was all over. But as he stepped out of his truck and headed towards his front door, something caught his eye. The black SUV was back. It was parked at the end of his street, just far enough away to be out of sight unless you were looking for it. Jason's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the vehicle, trying to make sense of what was happening. He stood there for a few minutes, debating his next move. Should he go over and confront whoever was in the SUV? Or should he call the police and report the suspicious activity? Neither option felt right. The police in Elmwood were good people, but they might not take him seriously, and confronting someone who was clearly trying to stay hidden could be dangerous. In the end, Jason decided to go inside and wait. He locked the door behind him and walked over to the window, peering out at the SUV. It hadn't moved, but its presence felt like a dark cloud hanging over his home. He couldn't ignore it any longer. Something was definitely wrong. The night passed slowly, with Jason unable to sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the SUV parked outside, its tinted windows hiding whatever secrets lay within. He kept checking the window, hoping to see the vehicle gone, but it remained in the same spot, a silent sentinel watching over his house. The next morning, Jason woke up groggy and unrest. He had finally managed to fall asleep in the early hours of the morning, but it hadn't been enough. He made himself a cup of coffee and sat down at the kitchen table, staring out the window. The SUV was gone, but Jason knew it would be back. As he sipped his coffee, Jason tried to figure out what to do. He couldn't keep living like this, constantly looking over his shoulder, waiting for something to happen. He needed answers, and the only way to get them was to confront whoever was in that SUV. Later that day, after he had finished his work at the community center, Jason decided it was time to take action. He left work early, hoping to catch the SUV off guard. As he drove home, he kept an eye out for the vehicle, expecting it to appear at any moment. Sure enough, as he neared his street, Jason spotted the SUV parked at the end of the block. His heart raced as he pulled into his driveway, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. He wasn't sure what he was going to say or do, but he knew he couldn't keep avoiding this confrontation. Stepping out of his truck, Jason took a deep breath and started walking towards the SUV. His footsteps were heavy, his heart pounding in his chest as he closed the distance. The closer he got, the more his nerves buzzed with anticipation. He didn't know what to expect, but he was ready to face it. When he was just a few feet away from the SUV, the driver's side window rolled down slightly. Jason could see a shadowy figure behind the tinted glass, but he couldn't make out any details. Before Jason could speak, the SUV's engine roared to life. The vehicle sped off down the street, tires screeching as it turned the corner and disappeared from view. Jason stood there, stunned, his heart still racing. The confrontation he had been preparing for had ended before it even began, leaving him with more questions than answers. As he walked back to his house, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. Whoever was in that SUV had gone to great lengths to follow him, and they weren't going to stop now. The mystery was only just beginning, and Jason knew that he was in for a lot more than he had bargained for. Jason spent the entire night restless, his mind racing with thoughts of the black SUV and the shadowy figure who had driven off before he could confront them. He couldn't shake the feeling that something big was about to happen, something that would disrupt the quiet, peaceful life he had built for himself. As the morning sun filtered through the blinds, Jason sighed, resigned to the fact that today might bring answers, whether he was ready for them or not. After his usual routine of coffee and breakfast, Jason decided to take a walk to clear his mind. The crisp morning air did little to calm his nerves, but he found solace in the familiar sights and sounds of his neighborhood. Children were playing in their yards, and neighbors waved as he passed by. For a moment, it almost felt like a normal day, but that sense of normalcy shattered when he returned home. As he approached his house, Jason saw the black SUV parked in the same spot it had been the day before. His heart sank, but this time, he wasn't filled with the same dread. Instead, a sense of determination settled in. He needed to find out who was behind this and why they were so intent on following him. Jason stood on his front porch, staring at the SUV. It was then that he noticed something different. Two men, dressed in sharp suits, were stepping out of the vehicle. They moved with an air of authority, their expressions calm and composed as they made their way toward him. "Good morning, Mr. Brooks," one of the men said as they reached the porch. He was tall, with graying hair slicked back neatly, and he spoke with a smooth, polished tone that immediately put Jason on guard. The other man, slightly younger and with a steely gaze, stood silently by his side. "Morning," Jason replied cautiously, not sure how to respond. He crossed his arms, trying to appear calm even as his mind raced with questions. The older man smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Philip Harper, and this is my associate, Mr. Larson. We represent the Covington family." Jason's brow furrowed in confusion. The Covington family? The name didn't ring any bells. "Yes," Harper continued, his voice smooth as silk. "I believe you had a brief encounter with one of their family members recently, Miss Laura Covington." Jason's eyes widened as he recalled the woman he had helped on the side of the road. The flat tire, the late hour, her nervous demeanor. It all came rushing back. "Laura Covington," he repeated, more to himself than to the man. "I didn't realize." "Laura is the daughter of Mr. Richard Covington," Harper explained, as if sensing Jason's surprise. "A name you might recognize. He's a well-known businessman. A billionaire, in fact." Jason stared at the men, trying to process what he was hearing. "I didn't know," he said slowly, still trying to wrap his mind around the idea that the woman he had helped was the daughter of a billionaire. "No, of course you didn't," Harper said, waving a hand dismissively. "Miss Covington didn't share her identity with you, and we understand why. It was a stressful situation, and she was likely more concerned with getting home safely." Jason nodded, unsure of what to say. The whole situation was surreal. He had simply done what he thought was right, helping someone in need, and now here were these men, representatives of a powerful family, standing on his porch. "What do you want from me?" Jason finally asked, his tone guarded. Harper smiled again, this time with a hint of something more, perhaps amusement. "We're not here to ask anything of you, Mr. Brooks. Quite the opposite, actually. We're here to offer you something." "Offer me something?" Jason echoed, his suspicion growing. "What could you possibly offer me?" Larson, the younger man, finally spoke up, his voice firm and direct. "We're here to reward you, Mr. Brooks, for your kindness, your selflessness. The Covington family doesn't take such acts lightly." Jason frowned, his mind racing. "Reward me? For what? I just helped her change a tire. Anyone would have done the same." "That may be true," Harper said, stepping closer. "But you did it, Mr. Brooks. You stopped, you helped her, and you asked for nothing in return. That means something to the Covingtons." Jason shook his head, still not understanding. "I don't need a reward. I was just doing what I thought was right." "And that's precisely why they want to reward you," Harper said, his tone earnest. "Your actions, your character, they stand out in a world where so many would have just driven by. The Covington family appreciates that." Jason looked from Harper to Larson, trying to read their expressions. There was something about the way they spoke, the way they carried themselves, that put him on edge. They were too polished, too practiced. He didn't trust them. "What kind of reward are we talking about?" Jason asked, his voice cautious. He didn't want to get involved in something he didn't understand, especially with people who clearly had a lot of power and influence. Harper exchanged a glance with Larson before answering. That, Mr. Brooks, is up to you. The Covingtons have the means to change your life in ways you can't even imagine. They could offer you money, a new home, a better job, whatever you desire. Jason's eyes narrowed. And what's the catch? No catch, Harper assured him, though the way he said it made Jason even more suspicious. This is simply their way of saying thank you, a gesture of goodwill. Jason didn't believe that for a second. Nothing's ever free, he said, shaking his head. Especially not from people like the Covingtons. Harper's smile faltered slightly, but he quickly recovered. I understand your hesitation, Mr. Brooks, but I assure you, there are no strings attached. You did something good, and the Covingtons want to repay that kindness. Jason stood in silence, trying to make sense of it all. It was tempting. Who wouldn't want their life to be easier? Better? But something deep inside him, a voice he couldn't ignore, told him that accepting anything from these men would come with a price he might not be willing to pay. I appreciate the offer, Jason finally said, his voice steady, but I'm not interested. Harper and Larson exchanged another look, this one less controlled. Larson seemed about to say something, but Harper held up a hand to stop him. Mr. Brooks, Harper began, his tone still calm but with an edge of insistence. Perhaps you should take some time to consider. This isn't an opportunity that comes along every day. Jason shook his head firmly. I don't need time to consider. I'm not interested. I live a good life, and I'm happy with what I have. I don't need anything from the Covingtons. Larson's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Jason thought the younger man might push the issue. But Harper quickly stepped in, his smile returning, though it was colder now. Of course, Mr. Brooks. We respect your decision. Jason nodded, relieved that they weren't going to press further. Thank you for understanding. Harper reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small card, handing it to Jason. If you change your mind, or if there's anything you need, don't hesitate to reach out. The Covingtons are always willing to help those who show kindness. Jason took the card, glancing at the simple, elegant design. It had only a phone number printed on it, with no other identifying information. He nodded, slipping it into his pocket more out of politeness than anything else. Thank you, he said, though he didn't plan on ever using the card. Harper and Larson nodded in unison, their businesslike demeanor returning. We'll take our leave now, Mr. Brooks, Harper said, turning to walk back to the SUV. We wish you all the best. Larson followed, his expression unreadable as he glanced back at Jason one last time before getting into the vehicle. Jason watched them go, his mind still reeling from the encounter. The SUV drove away, leaving him standing on his porch, holding the card in his hand. As the vehicle disappeared down the street, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. The Covington family was powerful, and they weren't the type to take no for an answer. He had no doubt that they would try to contact him again, and he wasn't sure how he would handle it when they did. He went back inside, the card still clutched in his hand. He stared at it for a long time, debating whether to keep it or throw it away. Part of him wanted to get rid of it, to remove any trace of the strange encounter from his life. But another part of him, the part that was curious and maybe a little afraid, told him to hold on to it just in case. Jason eventually tucked the card into a drawer in the kitchen, out of sight but not entirely out of mind. He tried to go about his day as usual, but the encounter with Harper and Larson lingered in his thoughts. Their vague promises, the way they spoke of life-changing rewards, it all felt too good to be true. And yet, there was a part of Jason that wondered what his life could be like if he had accepted their offer. What would it be like to have money, influence, power? To not have to worry about bills or work or anything else that had weighed him down for so long. But Jason knew himself well enough to know that those things wouldn't make him happy. He had always been content with the simple life he led, and he wasn't willing to trade that for anything, not even for the promise of something better. As the day went on, Jason tried to push the encounter from his mind, focusing instead on the things that mattered to him. He spent time with his friends, worked on a few projects around the house, and even went for a jog in the evening trying to clear his mind. But no matter what he did, He couldn't shake the feeling that the Covingtons weren't done with him yet. He knew that they would come back, and when they did, he would have to be ready. That night, as Jason lay in bed, he couldn't sleep. His mind kept replaying the conversation with Harper and Larson, the way they had spoken to him, the promises they had made. It all felt like a dream, something unreal that had intruded on his otherwise ordinary life. But as Jason stared up at the ceiling, he knew that this was his reality now. The Covingtons were real, and they had taken an interest in him. He just didn't know why or what they really wanted from him. And that uncertainty, that fear of the unknown, was what kept him awake long into the night. The next morning, Jason sat at his kitchen table, the early morning light streaming through the window. The decision he had to make weighed heavily on him. He had spent the entire night reflecting on everything that had happened. The black SUV, the men in suits, Laura's visit, and the offer that had been laid before him. It was an offer that could change his life, but it also came with strings attached. Jason had always valued his independence, his ability to live life on his own terms. The thought of becoming entangled in the Covington family's world of wealth and power made him uneasy, but he couldn't ignore the potential good that could come from accepting their offer. With the resources they were offering, he could make a real difference in his community. The thought of being able to provide for those in need, to create opportunities for the young people in his town, was something that deeply appealed to him. It was a chance to give back in a way he had never been able to do before. After hours of contemplation, Jason made up his mind. He would accept the offer, but only on his terms. He wasn't going to be a pawn in the Covingtons' game. If they wanted to reward him, it would be for the benefit of his community, not for their own interests. Later that day, Jason called the number the men had given him, his voice calm but firm as he spoke to one of the representatives. "I've made my decision," he said. "I'm willing to accept the reward, but there are conditions." The man on the other end of the line seemed surprised but intrigued. "We're listening," he replied. Jason took a deep breath and outlined his terms. He wanted the resources to go toward building a community center in his neighborhood, a place where kids could come after school, where adults could access job training and educational programs, and where families could receive support. He also wanted to set up a scholarship fund for underprivileged students, giving them the chance to pursue higher education. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Jason could hear the man discussing the terms with someone else in the room. Finally, the representative spoke again. "Mr. Brooks, we appreciate your proposal. We'll need to discuss this further with the family, but I believe we can come to an agreement." Jason felt a sense of relief wash over him. He had taken control of the situation, turning what could have been a burden into an opportunity to help others. The representative assured him that they would be in touch soon with the final details. The next few weeks were a whirlwind. The Covington family agreed to Jason's terms, and soon plans were set in motion to build the community center and establish the scholarship fund. Jason was at the center of it all, working closely with architects, community leaders, and educators to ensure that the projects would truly benefit those in need. As the days passed, Jason noticed a change in his life. The black SUV, once a source of anxiety and uncertainty, now followed him as a protective presence. It no longer symbolized mystery and fear, but rather the support and resources that were now at his disposal. He had gone from being a quiet, humble man who lived a simple life to someone with the power to create real, lasting change. Despite the newfound influence, Jason remained grounded. He continued his daily routines, stopping to chat with neighbors, helping out at the local church, and offering a helping hand whenever he could. But now, he had the means to do so on a much larger scale. The community center became a beacon of hope in the neighborhood, a place where people from all walks of life could come together and support one another. The scholarship fund gave young people a chance at a brighter future, one that many had never thought possible. One day, as Jason walked past the newly constructed community center, he saw a group of children playing basketball on the court, their laughter filling the air, a sound that warmed his heart. He smiled to himself, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. This was what it was all about, using what he had been given to uplift others. As time went on, Jason's story became well known throughout the town. People marveled at how a simple act of kindness had led to such a profound transformation. Not just in Jason's life, but in the lives of so many others. The ripple effect of that one moment when he stopped to help a stranded woman on the side of the road had spread far and wide. Jason remained humble through it all, never forgetting where he came from or the values that had guided him. He continued to help others just as he had before, but now with the added benefit of the resources and connections he had gained. He became a mentor to the young people in the community, offering guidance and support as they navigated their own paths in life. One evening, as the sun set over the town, Jason sat on the porch of his modest home, reflecting on everything that had happened. The black SUV was parked across the street, as it had been for weeks, but it no longer felt out of place. It was a reminder of the journey he had been on, of the choices he had made, and of the impact he had been able to have on the world around him. Laura had stayed in touch, visiting the community center and offering her own support to the projects Jason had initiated. She had found a sense of purpose in giving back, inspired by the kindness that Jason had shown her that night on the roadside. Together, they had forged a friendship based on mutual respect and a shared desire to make a difference. As Jason looked out at the town, he knew that his life had changed in ways he could never have imagined. But at his core, he was still the same man, humble, kind, and driven by a desire to help others. The wealth and influence he had gained were tools, nothing more, to be used in service of something greater. In the end, it wasn't the reward that had made the biggest impact. It was the act of kindness that had set everything in motion. Jason understood now that every action, no matter how small, had the potential to change the world. And that knowledge was the greatest reward of all. As he stood up and walked back into his house, Jason felt a deep sense of peace. He had made his decision, and it was the right one. His life was no longer just about himself. It was about the community, about the future, and about the endless possibilities that lay ahead. And as he closed the door behind him, he knew that whatever came next, he was ready for it. The road ahead was uncertain, but with the lessons he had learned and the people he had helped, Jason was confident that he could face anything with the same kindness and determination that had brought him this far. As Jason's journey shows us, sometimes the simplest acts of kindness can set off a chain of events that transform not just our own lives, but the lives of countless others. What started as a routine gesture of helping someone on the side of the road turned into a powerful reminder of the impact we can have when we choose to act selflessly. Jason's story teaches us that staying true to our values, even when faced with tempting offers, is what ultimately defines our legacy. Jason's decision to use the Covington family's resources to uplift his community rather than enrich himself serves as a powerful lesson in integrity and purpose. He reminds us that it's not about how much we have, but what we choose to do with it. The true measure of success isn't in wealth or influence, but in the positive changes we make in the lives of others. In a world that often feels dominated by self-interest and greed, Jason's story stands as a beacon of hope and a call to action. It challenges us to look beyond our own needs, to recognize the power of generosity, and to understand that every small act of kindness can have far-reaching effects. Whether it's offering a helping hand, a listening ear, or simply a moment of our time, we all have the ability to make a difference. So, what did you learn from Jason's story? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let us know how this tale of kindness and community has inspired you, and if there are ways you're planning to make a positive impact in your own life. If you enjoyed this story and found it inspiring, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. It's free and helps our channel grow, allowing us to continue sharing stories that uplift and motivate. Remember, together we can create a ripple effect of kindness that reaches far beyond what we can see. Thank you for being a part of this journey. Let's keep spreading positivity, one story at a time.